Hello and welcome to another edition of What's Going On, a segment in which myself, Wickett, and Michael Curzon discuss stories that don't quite make it to print. Um, we're talking today about vaccine passports. We discussed it in the last couple of What's Going Ons, but now it really seems like the cat's out of the bag here, and it's been all but confirmed by the government. So, Michael, what's going on?
Well, we're further than that, unfortunately. It's been confirmed by the government. All that needs to happen now is that it's approved in Parliament, which, given the track records of parliamentary voting over the past, 16 months regarding lockdown restrictions, where they've had the chance to vote, I'm sure they'll vote in favour. But it's been an interesting sort of U-turn in the last few days. One, which, when it came to the specific details, even I was quite surprised by this. So obviously in February, the vaccines minister quite famously said that that's not how we do things in this country when talking about vaccine passports, and he called them discriminatory. Now that in itself is bad enough when you compare it to 6 months later him saying we're introducing vaccine passports, but even sooner than that, literally 4 days before he made the announcement, he was asked on social media by I think a former pub or club owner why it isn't discriminatory to introduce vaccine passports essentially to prevent people from going to a venue because of their vaccination status. And he responded, it would be discriminatory if that were the only metric, as in if they were only judged whether they could come in on vaccination. But as happened at the sort of trial areas in Wimbledon, and as was first suggested for clubs, as they've been urged as part of their social responsibility for the past, day, I should say, since they reopened, was that alongside vaccination was proof of recent testing or proof that you've recently recovered from the virus within 6 months. But even that has been ruled out, even though, as I say, just 4 days ago, the vaccines minister said it would be discriminatory to base it just on vaccination. So essentially, what we're looking at, given parliamentary approval, which I think is guaranteed, from late September, if you're British and you've not had 2 doses of the vaccine, you will not be able to go to a nightclub or to another large indoor venue. And we can go into what that means in a moment because it's not actually been defined yet. But so that's essentially the stage. We are now directly a split society. Boris Johnson said some of the pleasures in life simply cannot be granted to those who are unvaccinated. We've been given no idea of how long this will last, how wide it will extend, because we know it's not just going to be nightclubs, and it's really quite a terrifying step, I think.
Yeah, no, it is. In the spirit of full disclosure, I'm not jabbed and I'm not going to be. So, I'm essentially watching my right to go about my life as I please debated in Parliament, and I think we can see the outcome coming. Absolutely stunning conclusion of the last 18 months.
It is, and we talked about France. What was it, a week ago? After Emmanuel Macron said, if you are unvaccinated, you can go to restaurants, bars, and even visit hospitals to check that your loved one is having proper treatment and is safe. And we said how at the time people in England were saying, what a terrible situation. How could they do that there? This is the country of liberty. And yet, as we warned then, it was already kind of happening at that point. I think we said in that episode that nightclubs fine are being urged to introduce vaccine passport checks, but it's very likely that they'll be forced to do so soon. And what I find particularly worrying, even though it's the same principle, it's a question, as I say, of just how far this extends. Now, the business minister was on doing the media rounds today. That's Tuesday, and essentially refused to rule out the notion that they could also be extended to pubs, because it was Kay Burley actually on Sky News who rightly said to him, well, some pubs are just as big as nightclubs and you've got just as much interaction in some of these places, so it's sort of illogical for them not to have vaccine passport checks. Not that that's something we want. But already we've seen that journalists won't be allowed to go to Downing Street for press conferences, go inside if they've not got proof of vaccination. So this isn't just nightclubs. It's not even just ticketed events. It's already extending far beyond that. and this is one day after the announcement. I think it's going to go much, much further. What we can hope, even though this still isn't a good situation, is that something like what happened in Israel takes place, which is where it was introduced for a bit as a threat, essentially, telling youngsters, if you don't get vaccinated, you won't be able to live your life. And then they sort of repealed it when enough people did get vaccinated. Although some reports suggest that threatening people in this way actually decreases their likelihood of getting vaccinated. So maybe that is what they have in mind, the government, that they'll introduce it a bit, hope vaccination increases, and then take it off. But if that research is true, and the government's view is to increase vaccination, then we could see this for quite a long time.
Yeah, it hasn't convinced me to do it.
No, nor me. It's made me more adamant, actually.
Yeah.
And it's worrying because, it's reason not to get vaccinated for people our age are sort of beyond the questions of side effects, which I think is still quite serious. But most importantly, the fact that people our age don't particularly need to be vaccinated. We're both quite young, and official statistics say that over the past year, the number of people under the age of 18 who died from the virus is 25. Although a recent article and some studies have said that even that might be exaggerated. And so for people our age, just a few years over that gap, it's not going to be particularly different. So that's why the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunology, has been quite hesitant about saying that children should be vaccinated against COVID, because they say, well, actually, we're not sure that the benefits outweigh the risk. And as I say, this isn't just for people up to the age of 18. It sort of seeps over that age gap. And there's a question of how high you get. Is it mid to late 20s? Is it early 30s? I'm not quite sure. But I think the important point is that at the very least, people should be given the choice as to whether or not they get vaccinated. And it's hilarious that, people defending this say, well, they do have the choice. Either they get vaccinated and they can go and do these things, or they don't get vaccinated and they don't. But that's not really how choice or liberty works. You can't say, well, I did allow you to do this, but if you say no, then you have every facet of your social life removed.
Yeah, I was saying in the last week in review, it's the mafia choice, right? It's you have a choice, but there's only really one choice that will benefit you in the long run. Let's just say. It's just stunning. I'm almost lost for words, and that's why I'm letting you sort of talk uninterrupted, because I really don't have much to say apart from I'm just utterly shocked at this. Not really. No. Look, they're now saying that antibodies and a negative test aren't enough. Well, they did trial events where they opened nightclubs, they opened sporting venues, they opened did all these large events, and in the criteria of entry was a negative test or antibody, and there was no jump up in cases as a result of those trial events.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sam. You're right to point out the trial events that were done. And I've got the figure here, actually, which is that the government carried out, over a certain period, 10 trial events, which involved 60,000 participants. So a pretty big number of people. You'd think you'd find something out from that. The number of positive test results which came out of this, and that in itself is skewed by all sorts of uncertainties, whether or not this was a genuine test, or indeed whether they tested positive specifically because of that event. But let's say it was a genuine COVID case, genuinely contracted or transmitted rather at these events. Out of the 60,000, 28 people tested positive. And this, as you say, was when entry was determined either by vaccination or positive test, or by recent survival, essentially, from the virus. So why is it that they've suddenly decided that from September, as well, that's a confusing point. Why from September, if they genuinely believe this? Why is it that they've suddenly decided, after these trials, which were incredibly successful? And one more note, actually, Will Jones, who writes a lot on Skeptics, made a really good point here, which is that they didn't have trials where people didn't have to undergo these measures. So they were never interested in finding out whether not even looking at testing negative before going there made much of a difference. But that to one side. Why is it that they've decided that despite these positive trials, and despite massively high number of vaccination across the population, that they've got to introduce vaccine passports, which must be among the most severe restrictions introduced over the last year yet. I suppose, lockdown, we could talk about lockdown forever, but that at the very least is imposed on everybody, other than, of course, the leaders who create the rules but decide to ignore them. Whereas these vaccine passports creates a really big societal problem where you've got a few people who don't want to get vaccinated for whatever reason. Who cares? It's their choice, and are essentially barred from enjoying normal life as a result of that. Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's going down. It's going to go down to a parliamentary vote, and we've seen that the Liberal Democrats are going to vote against it, which obviously is not enough to swing the vote. It really depends on how Labour votes, which is a more terrifying concept because their flavour of oppositionists who lambast the PM for not going far enough.
Yeah, I mean, all that we can hope. I think the only thing that might clinch this, which isn't a good thing, in fact, this might be purposeful. I hadn't considered this. What I was suggesting was that maybe the opposition says, actually, it's a little unfair just to do it off vaccination alone, or not even that it's unfair. It's just not necessarily worthwhile. Do it off negative tests as well. That's just as successful as we've seen from the trials. And then the government changes it as a result. Maybe that was purposeful. Maybe the government, we've discussed this on a few things relating to lockdown. They go all in. Everything goes in. And then they say, oh, okay, to be fair, we'll take a little bit back. Because, of course, vaccine passports where you can test negative before going somewhere is equally unfair. That's all, well, it's not quite equally, but it's still incredibly unfair. Like in France, they've just done that, where you can go to places if you test negative, but of course, at the same time, they increase the prices of tests from 0 to something fairly substantial, thus again increasing the pressure. So yeah, maybe there's a bit of political play going on here. We'll see, but I'm not hopeful either way.
No, me neither. Not in the slightest. But again, I don't really. If this is a psychological operation to ensure take up, I don't really see what their how they think this is going to go. Because I mean, I'm not sure if I represent the general sentiments of people who aren't vaccinated or not. But this makes me far less inclined to take it than I would be normally.
Yeah, I think the difference probably is, and this might be why the polling shows that people who don't want to take it are going to be even less likely to take it. I imagine that most people who aren't vaccinated probably aren't people who don't want to be vaccinated. They're just people who have very little drive and low energy and can't be bothered to go and get it. They don't think it's massively important, but at the same time, they're not bothered either way. So that if someone were to knock on their door and say, would you mind us vaccinating you today? And you don't have to come to us, you don't have to make an appointment, I'll do it for you this second. They'll say, well, yeah, okay, whatever. I don't have to lose any time over it. So that might be it. So therefore, they're catching the people who aren't against it, but they're not, so for it that they go rushing out of the houses to get the vaccine, which again might be why I imagine those sort of lazy people, when polled, would say, yeah, I'll take the vaccine. So that's not going to skew the result of people saying they'll be less likely, if you see what I mean there. So I can imagine it increasing take up, especially among younger ages where people, because of lower risk they have, are less interested. But yes, especially for people who now don't want to for particular reasons, including political or cultural reasons, it's probably going to lead people to dig their heels in.
Yes, and I think that is what's going on.
It is indeed. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Thank you for listening. I'm sure one of these days we'll come to you with a happy episode, but today another glum one. But thank you for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Cheers.